Hello, in this video we're going to look at the whole of paper 2 for the AQA GCSE Psychology spec. I'm going to go as quickly as possible, cover as much as possible, plug in. Hope you enjoy the ride. Okay, so the first topic in paper 2 is social influence, and the first part of social influence is conformity. Conformity is where someone changes their thoughts or behaviours due to a real or imagined group pressure, and the study here, which is a named study, so you need to know the aim, method, results, conclusion, is Ash's line study, famous study where participants had to judge the length of a line based on a target line. So the participants went into the room. There were 6 or 7 other people in the room. They were Confederates. They were working for the researcher, and the participants had to say which of the lines most fit the target line, and the Confederates would often say the wrong line. So what they found was 36.8% of the time the participants on the critical trials gave the wrong answer. So this suggests conformity occurs. 75% of participants conformed at least once, but that also means that 25% of participants didn't conform at all. So this suggests that people do change their behaviour based on a group. There are some evaluations of the study, of course. So to begin with, the study happened at a time of what was known as McCarthyism with Senator McCarthy, so in the 1950s in America, very conformist time because they were worried about the Cold War. It was also an artificial task, so that is obviously an evaluation that can be used in lots of different studies, but in this specific time, when in life are you really asked to judge a line length with a group of people? It's not really realistic. And also they think there's a cultural effect here. So you've got individualistic and collectivist cultures. Collectivist cultures are much more likely to go along with the group, so that's a weakness. Out of the social topic, you're going to look at things like social and dispositional factors. So the social factors affecting conformity are group size. So the bigger the group size, often the more conformity is. Certainly the magic number is about 3, so over 3 people, group size tends to have a more of an impact. It goes down slightly when there are larger groups over, say, 15. Anonymity also increased conformity, so when participants were able to give their answers anonymously, conformity decreased. So being anonymous decreases conformity. And then task difficulty, so in a more difficult task, people are more likely to conform. So those are the social factors that affect conformity. Dispositional factors. Dispositional means about the individual, so that's personality. So you've got something like locus of control. So you've got internal or external locus of control. Internal locus of control, you believe you're more in control of more responsible for your actions. External locus of control, you believe others are more responsible for your actions. So if you've got an external locus of control, then you're going to conform more. And then expertise as well. So if you're an expert in an area, you're less likely to conform in that area. So they asked people that were very good at maths to do maths tasks, and they were less likely to conform. So that's conformity and social influence. The next part is obedience. So that is listening to and acting on a direct order. There are 2 areas here. So the Milgram study, which is quite a famous study, the electric shock study, isn't actually named on the specification, but the 2 theories, and again it goes through the social and dispositional factors. So the social factors that are thought to affect obedience come from what's known as Milgram's agency theory. So agency is whether you believe you're acting on behalf of someone else or not, and when participants did the Milgram task, quite often they said that they thought the experimenter was responsible for the outcomes. They've also done tests on this and asked people who was responsible, and often they said it was the experimenter. So agency, if people feel that they're acting on behalf of someone else, they're more likely to conform. And you've got something known as the agentic state or the autonomous state. So if you're in an agentic state, you feel you're acting on behalf of someone else. If you're not, then you're in an autonomous state. Authority also affects obedience. So if you've got a legitimate authority figure, so in Milgram's study being a prestigious university wearing a white lab coat, that added to the legitimacy of the authority. And proximity as well. So when people can see the error of their ways, they can see what they've done. If they were forced, for example, to put the participant's hand onto a plate and they were faking being shocked, then that would reduce obedience. So there's this kind of moral strain that they talk about. That's the social factor affecting obedience. And then you've got Adorno's theory. So that's a dispositional factor. It's all about personality. And so the personality that you would talk about is the authoritarian personality. So someone with an authoritarian personality really believe in structure and hierarchy, and listening to and obeying orders. They've got this kind of fixed cognitive style where they see things as black and white and right or wrong. This often occurs in childhood. So strict upbringing and parenting often lead to this kind of authoritarian personality, and people with this personality tend to scapegoat. So there's kind of an in crowd and an out crowd, and again, that's kind of a dispositional factor that could lead to obedience. Next, you would then look at prosocial behaviour. This is the second name study, Pilyarvin's subway study, one of the studies that is a field experiment. So it was done on the subway in New York, and this is where they had participants either acting as drunk or acting as having needs. So one time they smelt of alcohol and carried a brown bag. The others, they appeared sober but were carrying a black cane, so looked like they were disabled. And they looked at whether people would help these people when they faked falling over. And what they found was that when the person was having if they looked like they had a disability, they would be more likely to be helped. So helping behaviour, 87% of the disabled victims were helped in the first 70 seconds, whereas only 17 of the drunk victims were helped in the first 70 seconds. So it does look like this kind of prosocial behaviour, and that there's impacts here in terms of characteristics of the victim, whether they helped or not. And as I say, that was a more natural environment. The task was more realistic because of that field experiment, which is a strength of the study, but obviously the sample was just in New York, so it was there's potentially sampling methods, and will that be found in other areas. There was also qualitative data here as well as quantitative. They asked people why they helped or why they didn't help, and they gave verbal answers, and so we had a bit more detailed information here. Again, you've got kind of social and dispositional factors as to why people would be more or less likely to show prosocial behaviour. So presence of others, so Darley and Latane found that when there are others, this is kind of the Kitty Genovese effect. It's known as the bystander effect. If there are others there, there's sometimes a thought that there's this diffusion of responsibility, so other people will do something. So sometimes others being there would be less likely to show helping behaviour. They didn't actually find that in Pilyarvin's study, but that was one thing. Presence of others could affect prosocial behaviour. And then the cost of helping. So if it's going to be dangerous for someone to help, if you're putting yourself in danger, or if you're embarrassed, then you might be less likely to help. But there's also the cost of not helping. So the the guilt of not helping someone could have an impact as well. So those are both social factors. You then got dispositional factors. So these are things to do with the individual, whether that will make them more or less likely to help. So you've got kind of similarity to the victim. So if you're more similar to the victim, say in age or gender or the clothes you're wearing, you might be more likely to help someone. There was a study done with Man United and Liverpool fans, and people were more likely to help people that supported the same team as them, wearing the same football shirt. And then there's expertise as well. So if you've got medical training and medical background, you might be more likely to help if there's a first aid, a medical disaster or medical emergency. So expertise of the individual can affect their prosocial behaviour. And then we've got crowd and collective behaviour. So this is where people act differently in a crowd. You've got something called de-individuation. So this is where someone doesn't act as themselves. They see themselves as they don't see themselves they don't seem responsible. So if they've got things like balaclavas on, if they feel like they're just part of the crowd, again, you could use football hooligans as that example, or a rioting crowd where people have often got balaclavas and things on. So it's a state in which people don't take responsibility for their own actions. And then you've got, again, social and dispositional factors that could affect crowd and collective behaviour. So crowd behaviour. For social, you've got kind of social loafing. So this is where, when we're in crowds, quite often you let other people take responsibility. There are some tests that have been done where people shouting, and if they're on their own, they would shout louder than when they're in a crowd, when people know it's them putting in effort on tasks as well. And you've also got culture. So again, you talk about this individualistic and collectivist culture. In a collectivist culture, people would be more likely to help the group, whereas in an individualistic culture like the UK or the US, that might be less likely to happen. And then dispositional, go back to locus of control, so internal or external. And if you've got an internal locus of control, you're less likely to help in a crowd. There's lower levels of conformity shown there. And because you're not going to be influenced by the impact of others and groups of people. And then there's morality as well. So some people have this kind of high sense of morality, this high moral compass. And so they would be more likely to help. And there were examples, you look at World War II, people going against the Nazi Party, even though they knew it would be really dangerous for them. So you've got this kind of moral fibre and moral strength that some people have that changes whether they act in a crowd or not. The second topic on paper 2 is language, thought and communication. So to begin with, you look at language and thought and the theories of where this comes from. So Piaget, obviously there's a link back to the developmental topic here, but Piaget says that thought comes before language. So as we looked at in developmental, Piaget believes in schemas and how we develop our thinking about the world. So Piaget was saying that the schemas come first, so the thought comes before the language, and then children would develop their language after they've got their thinking, after they've got their schemas. So he was saying that while children could use words, they might not understand them, so it would be parrot-like to begin with. And then he was saying that during the sensory motor stage, so about 1 year old, children start to talk, and then it gets a bit more developed, moving into about 2 years old. That's the pre-operational stage, so linking this back to Piaget's stage of development. And there's rapid development here, it gets a lot better, and then it gets more logical when they go later on, so that will be in the operational stage. There's lots of supporting research for this, and there's examples as well from other things and other areas. So the mummy sock example is the supporting evidence there. The counter theory, and that's a weakness of the Piaget theory, is the Sapir-Whorf or Sapir-Whorf hypothesis. So this says that language comes before thought. So the language happens first. And so this was, there's two versions of this. There's the weak version and the strong version. So the strong version would say that language determines thought, whereas the weaker version says language influences thoughts. People believe more in the weaker version nowadays. The example used here is Boas's research into Inuit, where Boas says that there were lots of different words for snow in the Inuit population, but that's been criticised in itself, and Pullum looked at that and said maybe there's only about 2, whereas Boas was saying there was more than 50. 27 at some sources and 50 at others, but yeah, Pullum said that was incorrect. And then we look at how our view of the world is shaped by our thought and our language. So 2 applications here, one to the recall of events. So the Hopi, it was said, didn't have words for past, present, future. Again, that's been criticised as maybe not being correct. And then it was the Carmichael study, which is where ambiguous figures, one that might either look like a dumbbell or some eyeglasses were given. And depending on how you described it, if you described it as a dumbbell, people would draw it as a dumbbell. If you described it as glasses, people would draw it as glasses. So your recall of events could be affected by how you describe a word. And then recognition of colours as well. So there's lots of research looking at different areas. So for example, the Zuni were thought to only have one word for different shades of yellow and orange, and this affected how they recalled that information. So we're looking at how our language changes how we see the world, changes how we see colours. Next, we looked at the difference between animal and human communication. named study. One of the named studies in this topic was von Frisch's famous bee study. So von Frisch was an ethologist, looked at how bees behaved, and wanted to see whether there was recognizable communication between the bees. So he manipulated their environment a bit. He put sugar water either close to the hive, so between 10 and 20 meters away, or further away up to 300 meters away. Made lots of observations here. He sometimes put a glass sheet on the front of the hive so he could see what was happening inside, and what he found was that there were different dances that the bees did depending on where the sugar water was. So if it was less than 100 meters away, they did what was called the round dance, where they danced in a circle. But if it was further away, they did kind of a figure of 8 dance, where they waggled their abdomen in the middle, and this was called the waggle dance. And the direction of the middle section determined where what direction the food was in relation to the sun, and how long it lasted for determined how far away the food was. So very detailed information here. So von Frisch suggested that bees do have sophisticated forms of communication. Very scientific approach, lots of scientific value. However, there are other factors that are also thought to be important. So if you maybe stop the bees from making sound, it reduces the chance of the message being sent. There was also, believe it or not, even being a bee study, just by having a bit of glass in their hive, that could have changed their behaviour. So the artificial task might have changed how the bees were behaving. And then we look at the different what animal communication does. So the 4 different functions of that. So survival, reproduction, territory, food. Survival, warning signs if they're in danger. So that was vervet monkeys. Reproduction, so mating displays. You think of peacocks. Territory, animals can mark their territory by spraying urine or walking their feces through it, and communicating food. So von Frisch's bees did that. And how that's different to human communication. So humans tend to be able to plan ahead a bit more. They tend to have creativity. And then there's this single versus multi-channel communication. So we can communicate in lots of different ways. Then start looking at non-verbal communication. So 3 different types of non-verbal communication that are named on the spec. First, you've got eye contact. So what does eye contact do? Well, it helps to regulate the flow of conversation, with people knowing when to start and stop talking. You've then got attraction. So if people are attracted to each other, they hold their gaze more. And then emotion. And so emotion is communicated, different emotions are communicated sometimes better or worse with eye contact. Next is body language. And so you can have different types of body language. You can have open or closed body language and posture. Then postural echo. So when people copy each other's postures and body language, they tend to have higher ratings. And then touch can sometimes have a positive impact if it's from the right person. And then personal space. So there are 3 things that seem to impact our interpretation of personal space. Cultural differences. So some cultures like being closer or further away. Gender differences. So for example, men with other men like to be further away than women do with other women. But when it comes to talking to friends, men prefer to be sat opposite a friend, whereas a woman would prefer to be sat next to them. I mean, this is just what the research says, each their own. And then status. So when there's hierarchy within, say, a company, an organization, people of the same level tend to talk differently to each other than they would of people from different levels. And then finally, starting to look at the explanations for nonverbal communication. So why do these things happen? So firstly, you've got Darwin's theory. Darwin came up with a theory of natural selection and says that all of our behaviours, all the things that we've got at the moment are the way they are because they're innate, they're adaptive, they've allowed us to pass on our genes. And so some examples of non-verbal communication that might have done that. So if you've got disgust, if you're smelling something that you shouldn't be eating, you might wrinkle your nose. If you're trying to deter a predator or someone you don't like, you might bare your teeth. So Darwin called these serviceable habits, similar in animals and humans. And then there's a question whether non-verbal communication is innate or learned. So obviously Darwin would say it was innate, things like social releases. So this is babies laughing and smiling, having big eyes are social releases. They're designed to make them be cared for. But also the fact that you've got some individuals who are sensory deprived, so people that might be born blind, still show the same sort of emotions that others do. So they can't have learnt it, they can't have seen it, so it must show that it's at least partly innate. However, there are some examples as well that show that non-verbal communication is learned. So you've got different cultural expectations, contact and non-contact cultures. So you've got kind of Latin cultures that are more contact orientated. You've then got kind of more kind of Western UK, USA that are non-contact orientated, to suggest that there's cultural variation in non-verbal communication, which suggests that it's learned or environmental. You've also got gestures, which mean different things in different places. So again, that suggests it's learned. And then the second named study in this topic is the Yuki study, which looks just at this. So it looks at cultural differences in non-verbal communication. So they asked Japanese or American students to look at emoticons and see whether they were happy or sad based on the eyes or the mouth, and found that there are differences there between the American and the Japanese students. So the Americans look more at the mouth, whereas the Japanese look more at the eyes. You can criticize that. So it was an artificial task. Obviously, looking at emoticons aren't real emotions, and there's only a few emotions that were looked at, and it was all done via a rating scale. Topic 3 in paper 2 is the brain and neuropsychology. So to begin with, you need to look at the nervous system. You need to know the function and structure of the nervous system. So you've got the central nervous system, the CNS, which is the brain and spinal cord. You've got the peripheral nervous system, which is the rest of the nervous system. You've then got the somatic nervous system, which is the voluntary movements. And then you've got the autonomic nervous system. So that's involuntary movements. You've got the the sympathetic branch, which is the fight or flight response, and then you've got the parasympathetic branch, which brings back to kind of rest and digest, homeostasis. And then you need to link that to the James Lange theory of emotion, which states that there's an event and arousal happens, you interpret that arousal, and then there's emotion. And so it's whether that's a linear process that's obviously being then countered by the Cannon-Barr theory, which says arousal and emotion happen at the same time. And then you've got the two-factor theory, which says that social cues are really important as well. Then you need a bit more detail on the structure and function of neurons. So neural structure, you need to know what dendrites are, the axon going through the middle. You've then got the myelin sheaths, which cover the axon. You've got nodes of Ranvier, which are the gaps in between. And then you've got action potential, which is to do with the charges in the neurons. You've then got synaptic transmission, reuptake, although that's one of the last things that happens, and then you've got the vesicles which come down the axon, released into the synaptic cleft. So that's another term you need to know. And then you've then got your receptor sites on your postsynaptic neuron, and then reuptake in your presynaptic neuron. And then you need to know about excitation and inhibition. So different neurotransmitters such as adrenaline is excitatory, and then serotonin is inhibitory, and then summation. So if you've got enough positive charges, it will then release the action potential. And so you've got this neurochemical, electrochemical transmission down neurons. You've then got Hebb's theory of learning. So Hebb suggests about neuroplasticity. So we're always learning throughout our lives. If there's brain damage, then you can potentially, depending on the severity, other areas of the brain can compensate for it. This would link to Maguire's taxi driver study, where London taxi drivers had bigger hippocampus than those not doing the knowledge test. You've got things called engrams. So this is single traces of single cells, single thoughts, and then you've got cell assembly. So cells, neurons that fire together, wire together, so you get links to different areas of the brain. So that's theory. You've then got the brain, so you need to know the structure and function of the brain, so the different areas of the brain, the different lobes. You've got the frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and the temporal lobe. And then you need to know the localization of the function, so what happens in these. So at the back of the frontal lobe, you've got something called the motor area, so this controls motor movement. You've then got the somatosensory area, which is at the front of the parietal lobe. You've then got the visual cortex, the visual area, which is in the occipital lobe, and the auditory and language areas tend to be in the temporal, although there is some link to the frontal lobe as well. Then you need to know about Penfield's study. So Penfield's study is the name study on this topic, and that's where Penfield, while doing surgery for epilepsy, attached electrodes to different areas of the brain and stimulated them and looked at what happened. When the occipital lobe was stimulated, people would see images that weren't there. When the motor cortex was stimulated, people would move their limbs. When the somatosensory area was stimulated, they would feel tingling and sensation in their limbs that weren't happening. Some of the key areas here were to do with the temporal lobe and experiences that happen there. So Penfield's study, very scientific, looking into different brain regions. And then you've got neuropsychology, so looking at cognitive neuroscience, so the link between thinking and the biology, so the different areas of the brain, how brain damage can affect that. So the brain damage that you look at is something like a stroke, which is bleeding on the brain, and the impact that may have. So obviously if it's in the motor cortex, you're going to have issues with movement of the body, and this is often cross-lateral, hemispheric, so the right side of your brain controls the left side of your body. How do we tell that? Well, there are scanning techniques. So there's a PET scan, positron emission tomography. There's a CT scan, computerized tomography, or there's fMRI, functional magnetic resonance imaging. And these all show the brain in different areas. So CT scan is like an X-ray. It shows the anatomy of the brain, but maybe not functional. Whereas in a PET scan, you've got a radio tracer, and so you can see different areas of the brain that are active and metabolizing, and then you've got functional magnetic resonance imaging, and again you can see active areas of the brain. And then the second named study here is Tolving's Gold Memory Study. So that was the 6 participants who were injected with the radiochemical. The radiochemical was gold, which is why it was called Tolving's Gold Memory Study. And what he did was get participants to recall semantic, so factual memories, or episodic memories, personal memories, and wanted to see if these were related to different areas in the brain. And he found that yes, that was the case. So when participants were asked to recall semantic memories, these generally were shown in the parietal or occipital lobes, and when it was episodic memories, these tended to be in the frontal and temporal lobes. So backed up this idea of localization of function, different areas of the brain linked to different regions, is a good example of a PET scan, so for your scanning techniques, but obviously there are evaluations here in terms of small sample size. Only 50% of the participants, 3 of the participants, showed those differences. And last but not least, the final topic is psychological problems. So we start by looking at mental health and poor mental health. So mental health is factors linked to Jehosh's list, where we can deal with problems in the world, we can hold down a job, we can have functional relationships. So that's we can self-actualize, characteristics of good mental health. You then talk about mental health issues or problems. So mental health problems are when things don't go well. So can't hold down a job, can't hold relationships, have poor sense of self-worth. So incidents of mental health problems have increased over time. That's how they change over time. Incidents numbers are going up. The reason for that is some of the reason is due to the challenges with modern living. So you've got things like loneliness that are increasing. The cost of living is putting more pressure on people. You've also got lessening social stigma, and so people are more likely to talk about it and seek help, so that's a positive potentially. You've also got cultural variations in mental health issues, so for example, hearing voices can be seen as a mental health problem in the Western world, but in other areas it might be seen as a religious experience, for example. You've then got individual effects and social effects of mental health problems. So you've got, for example, the individual effects, so issues with relationships, issues with coping with day-to-day life, issues with physical well-being are individual effects, and then you've got social effects, so cost of social care, increased crime rates, and that will impact the economy as well. Then you go into the two mental health problems. So firstly, depression. You need to know about the diagnosis of depression, the difference between just being sad and being depressed, the difference between unipolar and bipolar depression. So with bipolar, you've got episodes of mania. And then the symptoms, obviously you need low mood for depression to be diagnosed, loss of interest and pleasure, reduced energy levels, plus change in sleep, change in appetite, change in self-confidence. And then you go into looking at how you would define these things, and how you'd explain them. So there's a biological explanation, so that's low levels of serotonin, linking back to the brain and neuropsychology topic. There's a psychological explanation, so this is all to do with faulty thinking, negative schemas. So schemas comes up in different places, doesn't it? Looking at Piaget. And then you've got negative attribution theory, so that's stable, internal and global, and links to Seligman as well. And then therapies, how do you treat it? Well, the biological therapy is linked to the biological explanation. So if you think it's low levels of serotonin, you can offer people selective serotonin reuptake inhibitors, SSRIs, with the hope of increasing the levels of serotonin that are available by blocking the reuptake. And that has been found to be helpful for treating some of the symptoms. And then if you think it's about people's thinking, you need to change their thinking. So that's cognitive behavioural therapy, where people are given their therapist challenges their negative thoughts. They're asked to do homework at home to check these things. And that's where Wiley's study comes in, where they're then assessing how CBT, along with antidepressants, SSRIs, are seen as successful. So more successful than just antidepressants on their own, because you're treating the underlying cause as well as the symptoms, and it's been found to have an effect over time as well. Then looking at addiction, you've got diagnosis of addiction, so you need to know the difference between dependence, which is a withdrawal state, and addiction. And then symptoms of addiction, so this is desire to use despite harm, difficulty in controlling the use, priority given to the substance over other things, this withdrawal state, tolerance and needing more of the substance to get the same effect. Biological explanation says it's inherited and runs in families, and so that's the second name study here. So Wiley's study is the first name study in this topic. Second is Cage's twin study, where they looked at the temperance board register with monozygotic and dizygotic twins, and found that identical twins, monozygotic twins, are more likely to have a sibling with struggles with alcohol if they have one, if there is one of the siblings that has struggles with alcohol, which suggests a biological underpinning. And then psychological explanation, so this is to do with social learning theory, social norms, having a social group that's more linked to some of the addictive substances, smoking, drinking, drugs, for example, might make you more likely to partake as well. You've got this kind of social environment that means the substances are more available. And then looking at the therapies, you've got aversion therapy. So this is where you would link to classical conditioning, you would link the desired substance with a negative outcome. So, for example, with alcohol use, the patients are given antabuse, which is a drug that makes you vomit, and so you associate vomiting with drinking. You can do that with gambling. They were giving electric shocks when they came up with their gambling terms, and then smoking until they felt sick. It's been found to work, but obviously the people that need the help, it's quite a difficult thing to stay in. You have to be very motivated to have that level, and it's difficult to stay in. The other therapy is self-management. So these are things like 12-step programs, Alcoholics Anonymous, Narcotics Anonymous, and those are things like submitting to a higher power. It was God to begin with, but this can be a bit wider now, and again been found to work fairly well, but obviously have to stay in the program as well. So hopefully that gives you a nice overview of paper 2. Good luck if you've got any assessments coming up. Hope you cook.